On this channel, we've covered many accidents and incidents before. However, there is one that I have been wanting to cover for a long time now, but because of how sensitive it is, I never really felt right covering it. But after talking with some people, I decided that today is the day. So buckle up, because today we're going to find out what really happened on PIA Flight 661. Now, before we start, I just want to say that this video is not meant to disrespect anyone, especially the families who lost someone on this flight. This is purely an aviation video that focuses on the incident itself and how it happened. It is an interesting incident that has many theories behind it, but today we will get into the truth. Pakistan that took off from Karachi at 2:32 a.m. local time bound for Islamabad. On board were 147 passengers and 7 crew members. The pilots had planned for a 1:01 and 5-minute flight, which was longer than usual due to expected weather conditions along their route. About 40 minutes after takeoff, the pilots turned on the autopilot and engaged the altitude pre-select function. The plane was then maintained at its current altitude of 9,000 feet. At around 2 hours and 40 minutes into the flight, the pilots started their descent into Islamabad. As they made their way down to the airport, they noticed that the weather was worse than they had expected earlier. Due to the poor weather, the pilots requested to be put on a holding pattern about 15 nautical miles southwest of the runway. This meant that the plane would fly in a circular pattern. While waiting for the weather to clear, the controllers obliged and the plane started making the first leg of the holding pattern. Shortly afterwards, the captain initiated a left bank and a descent to start the second leg of the holding pattern. This is where things get weird. At this point, the first officer called out that they were at 9,000 feet, which was the lower limit of their holding pattern. He also said we can go down a little more. After getting clearance from ATC, the first officer pushed the altitude knob down to 6,000 feet. But the plane kept descending further. The first officer called for 3,000 feet, and the plane kept going down. Then the captain started pushing buttons and switches in an attempt to pull the plane out of the dive. They managed to level the plane off at about 1,200 feet. Shortly afterwards, Flight 661 impacted terrain at 2:58 a.m. local time, killing everyone on board. Like I mentioned earlier, there are many theories surrounding this crash. And if you do some research online, you'll find all sorts of stories. But in this video, I'm going to tell you the truth. One of the theories that surrounds this accident is that the pilots intentionally crashed the plane due to a disagreement between the two. In fact, when the CVR was being analyzed, one pilot could be heard saying, "I told you," just before impact. Many believe that these 3 simple words meant that the captain was blaming the first officer for the crash. Now, this theory makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Do you think that the first officer would risk the lives of everyone on board just to win an argument with the captain? I don't think so. Another theory is that the pilots fell asleep and somehow missed their way out of the holding pattern. This one is more plausible, but still doesn't make much sense. The pilots did miss their altitude and ended up diving towards the ground, but that does not mean that they fell asleep and didn't notice. If that was the case, why did the captain try to recover from the dive? No, the pilots were fully aware of what was happening until the very end.
So what really happened on PIA Flight 691? Well, it all starts with the BVR, the Board of Visit and Review.
If you haven't heard about them before, the BVR is the agency that checks the airworthiness of planes. Within Pakistan, it's basically the Pakistani version of the FAA. Now, since this was a domestic flight, it did not need to adhere to international standards, meaning that the BVR was in charge of the maintenance of this aircraft. In 1996, the BVR conducted an audit of the airline to check if its planes were airworthy. They found that PIA was struggling to meet the required standards and gave them a list of recommendations that needed to be done to ensure safety. One of those items was about the autopilot system. Reports stated that the autopilot was not functioning properly and recommended that the affected systems be fixed. That recommendation was entered into the logbook of the plane, but nothing was ever done. This became a serious problem for the airline because in 1997, they introduced new routes into their network that heavily relied on the use of the autopilot system. Fast forward to September of 2002. The engineering staff of PA were in the process of upgrading the autopilot system of this plane. You see, after the crash, investigators went through the data that was stored on the flight data recorder. They found that the altitude hold mode was indeed disabled. To their surprise, they found that the pilots would have no idea that the plane was diving until it was too late to recover. This brings us back to the cockpit. When the first officer engaged the autopilot, he likely did not know that the altitude hold mode was disabled. Since the autopilot was disabled, the only way to keep the plane at that altitude would be to manually trim the plane and keep adjusting it every once in a while. Since the pilots did not know that the autopilot had such a big problem, they probably thought that it was working perfectly fine. Thus, when the plane started diving, they were completely caught off guard. When the captain started pushing buttons and switches, he was trying to engage the autopilot again to level the plane off. But since the altitude hold mode was disabled, the plane kept diving. Sadly, by the time they realized what was happening, it was far too late. The crash of PIA Flight 661 is tragic and sad. It's sad that innocent lives were lost, and even more tragic that those lives could have been saved had the BVR done their job properly. Had they fixed the issues that they noted down in the logbook, this accident would have been avoided. Instead, they chose to ignore it, placing profit over safety. Thank you for watching this episode. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help us grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.